What shall we say then? That's the lead-in question. Here's the important one. Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Shall we go on sinning so that grace may increase? Now there's the question where we start. That's where our passage starts. And that question forces me immediately to ask you, all of you, two questions. Have you ever asked this question? Now, young people, you don't mind me talking to you directly once or twice, do you? Have you ever asked this question? Shall we go on sinning so that grace may increase? If you've never asked the question, I think you may have to face up to the fact, very many of you at least will have to face up to the fact, that you're not actually a Christian. I'd like to repeat that. If you've never asked the question, I think you may have to face up to the fact, very many of you at least will have to face up to the fact, that you're not actually a Christian. It would be very hard to understand Romans chapters 1 to 5 and not ask that question. If you haven't understood Romans chapters 1 to 5, it's actually quite likely that you haven't understood the gospel. And if you haven't understood the gospel, quite frankly, you're not a Christian. What does Romans chapter 5 tell us? It tells us that God is. And whoever you are, and whatever you say about yourself, you know that God is. You know that in the same way as you know that you are, and you also know that you are not the person sitting next to you. And you know that God is eternal. You know that, you do. And you know that God is invisible. And you know that God is powerful. And you know that God made you. You do. And you also know that God will judge you. Romans chapter 1 teaches that, and chapter 2. And Paul says, you know all that, but you've lived to please yourself. And therefore, God, this eternal, invisible, creating, powerful, judging God, is actively furious with you as a man or woman. Now immediately when people hear that sort of preaching, they say to themselves, well, I'm not like that at all. Yes, you are, says the Apostle Paul. Some of you have God's law, you have His word, you know His rules, you've got the Bible, but you don't do what it says. Some of you have all sorts of privileges, a spiritual upbringing, but you haven't used your privileges to the full. And therefore, as a Christian preacher, I can look in the mirror and I can point the finger at the man in the mirror. And therefore, I can also point the finger at every one of you in God's name and say you are guilty. And whatever happens from this day onwards, you will always be guilty. Romans 1 to 5 is strong on this point. And then it comes in with the message of God's kindness. God is supremely and wonderfully kind to guilty people. And in history, a mysterious exchange has taken place. Millions of guilty people, who should therefore be punished for their sins by an internal, invisible, powerful, creating judge. Millions of people who should suffer for their sins don't. Because their sins have been put to somebody else's account. That's in Romans 1 to 5. And there's more news than that. Those millions of people not only have their sins forgiven, But the one perfect life, the only one perfect life that's ever been lived in this world, has been put to their account. And so the gospel is this mysterious exchange. And I'm not ashamed of it, says the Apostle Paul, because in it the righteousness of God is revealed. That righteousness put to a guilty sinner's account. It's wonderful news, isn't it? And how do these millions of people enter into the forgiveness of sins and peace with God? By faith alone in Jesus Christ. They don't have any merits, they don't have anything to recommend them to God, they don't have anything at all which is in their favour. Jesus Christ has all the merits, and those are the merits put to their account, and they receive him, and they embrace him, and they trust him, and they rely on him as he's offered to them, freely offered to them in the gospel. He's the last Adam. One Adam ruined us, all of us, and one Adam only saves us, by one great life of obedience and one great atoning death. When did God send Christ? When sin was at its worst. When did God save you? When you were at your worst. Where sin was abounding, grace superabounded. If that's the case, why shouldn't we go on sinning? So that grace may increase. And anyone at all who's understood the gospel, therefore, at some time, has asked chapter 6, verse 1. And if you've never asked the question, it's probable that you're not a Christian. It's a time to get alone with God, even in the seat where you are, and to own up to the fact that you've been Christianized, but you've not yet been converted. And to own up to the fact that you've never really understood the freeness of it all, and the wonder of it all, and you've never really trusted Jesus Christ only for your standing with God. I trust that even this morning, many of you will come to Christ. You'll realize at last that that's the mess you're in, and that you'll come to the Saviour. And you'll understand that his grace and kindness is truly free and unmerited and abundant and abounding and generous. And that you'll come to such a Saviour as that even in the meeting. So you see, chapter 6 verse 1 immediately raises one question. Now it raises another question which I must also ask you. Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Shall we continue in sin? Can you now see from that question what godliness is? Paul is tackling the question as to why a Christian should not go on sinning. He's going to show us over the next chapter why a Christian should not go on sinning. So what is godliness? It is not sinning. Now it's very important to get hold of this. Now godliness is a moral quality. I'd like to repeat that. Godliness is a moral quality. When was Adam godly? When he was in the garden, not sinning. How do we know Jesus was godly? Because he lived 33 and a half years amongst us, not sinning. Who is the most godly person in the hall? Well, the person who sins the least. Who is the person who's the least godly here this morning? Well, the person who sins the most. Godliness is a moral quality. No, it's not a mystical quality. In the 19th century, there was a famous preacher in the United States He had enormous influence, and he traveled throughout most of the United States. On one occasion, when he was preaching and doing a series of meetings in a certain town, he went to visit a factory. And as he was visiting that factory and walking through the factory where all the looms were working and there was a great deal of noise, the people who worked in the factory suddenly felt a strange influence. Many of them stopped working. Many of them broke down in tears. Just because he was in the building. You will be tempted to conclude from that Charles was a very godly man, because he gave out those sort of vibes. I don't know whether he was a Christian or not, but that's not my subject. What I do know is that in many things he taught, he was a very ungodly man. And the fact that he gave out these vibes actually tells us nothing about his godliness or lack of it. The most godly person in the room this morning may not give off any vibes at all. You might be sitting next to that person. But because they don't have any public gifts or any influence, you're not picking it up. Godliness is not a mystical quality. It is a moral quality. It's not sinning. Now, if I can stop at this point, I'd like to remind you that some of you, every thought and action you've put into two columns. That's not sinning, and that's sinning. I want to invite you to be more submissive to the Bible. Every thought and action can be put in three columns. That's sinning. That's not sinning. And this is an area of Christian liberty where it would be sinning if my conscience troubled me, but if my conscience doesn't trouble me, it's not sinning. Godliness is about not sinning. How do you know what sin is? By God's law.